Well, thank you all for joining us today. My name is Hayley Tsukayama. I'm legislative activist with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I will be your moderator today. And we're going to start by going down the table and letting my fellow panelists introduce themselves. So.
Cool.
All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for coming out this afternoon. My name is Kurt Opsahl. I am the Deputy Executive Director and General Counsel at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. One of the things that EFF has been working on, it's a nonprofit organization that fights for your rights online and with your digital devices. And one of the things that we've been working on is trying to establish your rights at the border. So we have a case against the government right now to try to establish that the Fourth Amendment fully applies at the border, as well as your Fifth Amendment, First Amendment, 14th Amendment rights. And trying to push back on the government's attempts to make it a constitution-free zone. But anyway, we'll talk today a lot about what are the risks that you're currently facing at the border and taking your device across it. I'm looking forward to it.
Hi, I'm Ankara Chappell. I am the Freedom of Information Coordinator for the Department of Human Services in the city of Virginia Beach. I am also a senior litigation paralegal, and so I'm interested in freedom of information and also interested in a lot of the information that EFF works on and imparts, and like to try to support where I can and when I can.
Thank you.
And I'm Randal Schwartz. I've been on many panels here on the EFF track. I travel frequently. I've been in 62 countries. So I come back into the U.S. frequently, and I want to know more about what my rights are as I come in. And I'm also the designated Googler. So if there's something comes up that needs to be Googled, I am it. And you'll see it on the screen.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I think actually you bring up, a very good question, and that's one that was in the description, right? No, you do bring up a very good question.
Right. That's why they put me on this panel.
That's right. Well, good. So, I think we could start there, right? With what kind of precautions should people be taking? What if you are confronted at the border with someone asking, to see your device? What are the steps that you can take?
Well, one of the things I'm always worried about is can I just erase my phone on my way in, and would that be suspicious?
Well, so if you're coming into the United States with your digital devices,
right.
There's some chance that you'll just pass through customs and nothing will be an issue. At which point that will not be suspicious because they would have looked at your phone. But sort of the harder situation comes up when you are being brought for extra scrutiny, and they may ask to see your phone. And at that point, you have some pretty terrible choices. You could choose to allow them to see your phone, and then that would be, they may construe that as a consent search. They usually will ask it in a manner of like, hey, do you mind if I take a look at your phone or something like that, so that if you say, yes, if they eventually looking at your phone, they will say that you consented to it. If you consent, then they will say that therefore, to the extent that you had any rights, you have waived them. However, they can also try to search your phone without your consent. Then usually that requires reasonable suspicion, right, which is a standard that is far different from a warrant where it's probable cause, where they have to go to a neutral magistrate and show that there's probable cause that there'll be evidence of a crime, but rather reasonable suspicion.
Well, at what point am I required to give my passport or password or my face ID?
You can do what you want, but you have to face the consequences of what you do. So if you say, no, I'm not going to give you my password, or if you're a U.S. citizen, they can't stop you from coming in. If you're not a U.S. citizen, they can stop you from coming in. They can say, all right, no problem, but you're turning right around, getting back in that plane, and flying back to where you came from. And so for a lot of people, that is a pretty high price to pay after they've already flown to the United States. But if you're a citizen, you could say, I refuse to do this, but then they might take your digital devices and say, okay, we're going to take it for further analysis. And then they're going to do the analysis, and it might take, many, many months before you get your device back.
Right. Right.
And you might have to have a bet about whether they're better at cracking your device than you are at securing it. And that is a pretty terrible choice as well.
Yes. I was involved in a felony case where they took my devices for 3 months, so I know what that's like, where they had the ability to analyze my devices for 3 months. So I completely understand that. So I'm at the border. I'm a U.S. citizen white guy, so it's pretty easy for me to just come through. But
Congratulations.
what should we change to make this fair?
Well, look, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think there are many things that are factors in whether or not that you are going to be detained at the border. And they will look over where you've been traveling from. They'll make judgments, and I think some of those judgments are going to be based on stereotypes and assumptions about people, about whether or not that forms this sort of reasonable suspicion, which again is a very light standard. And some of this will also depend on your answers to questions. They might ask a few threshold questions and see what your answers are. And depending on those answers or whether you were, in their view, being cooperative, they may escalate things or de-escalate them. And hopefully you can get through that. I mean, sometimes there have been reports of people who have been asked to open their devices and have talked the Border Patrol out of it. But I think that's a pretty high stakes maneuver, because they'll probably say, well, what do you got on there, and you might have to answer some questions about what's in your device, which will be potentially revealing information about you.
Do you generally recommend that people sort of cooperate with those questions, or does it change based on sort of what kind of person you are, that you may be, answers may be taken differently?
I think absolutely one important thing is there's a huge difference between citizens and non-citizens. Because if you don't have a right to continue on to your destination, then they can turn a visa holder away for any reason. And they just don't like the looks of you or what have you, and it's virtually impossible to appeal that decision. So this makes it a very tough thing for people who are coming in on visas to do anything besides be cooperative, because they can just turn you around. If you are a citizen, then you have a few more options. But I actually would like to move on to maybe some other strategies that people can use. One thing that Randal mentioned, well, should you erase your device? Well, the strongest way of protecting data when you cross a border is to not have it with you. If you have a completely erased device, maybe that would raise some suspicion, but you can certainly remove sensitive data, especially if you have it backed up somewhere, and then reinstall it from the backup after you get through the border. You can go and log out of your various apps, so your Facebook and your Gmail apps and all these things are not logged in, so if someone does get access to your phone, they won't be able to use that phone to get access to your cloud data. Now, we think that you definitely require a warrant if you're going to take it to cloud data, and as I believe as a matter of policy, the CPB has said that they agree, though you might find your mileage varies with individual agents. We have something up here on the big screen.
Yeah, talking about the ACLU, saying that these searches violate Fourth and First Amendments.
Indeed,
so yeah,
we've actually partnered with the ACLU in our lawsuit on that.
Yeah, exactly.
Kara, I'm interested to know if there are sort of experiences that you've had, or sort of what your concerns are. Why you dealing with this issue.
Well, so I was reading the case actually filed by you, and it's good reading. One of the questions that I had, I think you said that there were 10 people, or there were 11?
I think it's 11.
Okay, so 10 were U.S. citizens and one was a U.S. national, was that correct?
So I should say that this is something that EFF has done, but we do many things, and I have actually not directly worked on this case, though I have worked on the overall border issue.
Okay,
So I think it's 11.
It appears, just from reading it, that, and this is just my take on it, that there might be a fair amount of profiling going on
Yeah.
when they're doing these searches. So, I mean, that's just my initial take on it. And how do you feel about that?
Profiling. Yeah, I mean, that absolutely is profiling, and that is something that really allows a lot of discretion for border agents to use their existing assumptions and prejudices about people to decide whether or not they are subject to additional scrutiny. That can have a very unfair effect, especially on marginalized communities.
One question, a couple people came up to us at the booth today ahead of this panel, and one question that somebody asked was, when we're talking about the border, we're talking about border security, there's of course the physical border zone, and then they were also curious if it just means any international airport where they may come in. So sort of where do these different rules, such as they are, apply?
So according to the government, they apply everywhere that's within 100 miles of the border, which is a big chunk of the United States. Plus, of course, at every airport, port of entry. So it's a pretty wide swath that they feel that these special border rules apply. And most of the time, you're going to experience it directly at the border as you land in an airplane or as you cross one of the land borders or maybe come in on a ship somewhere. But especially at the land borders, they will often have checkpoints that are many miles on the interior and ask to see your papers as you pass through the checkpoints.
We don't need no stinking papers.
Yeah.
I think this is probably a panel where we have a lot of questions, so I think I'm going to open it up actually for audience questions.
Yeah, that'd be good.
So if you could, we have an orange
Please
box.
have the box. Please have the box when you speak.
Yes, thank you.
Are there any particular
Could you speak up just a little? I'm sorry.
Are there any particular applications you would recommend putting on our devices so that we can do things like brick our phone from space should someone get away from us?
So
No.
That's a good question, and I want to say that it's a high risk maneuver if you want to try and brick your phone from space after it has gone into the hands of the CPB, because they might say that you are engaged in destruction of evidence, and destruction of evidence might actually have harsher penalties than other things that might have been on there. Now, if you have a encryption on the phone, which you probably do if you have a modern phone, turn the encryption on, set it to require a complicated and lengthy password or passphrase, and turn off the phone. Because if you turn off the phone for most modern operating systems, if it goes back on again, then face recognition, Face ID, thumbprint IDs will not work, and you have to type in the password. So that also prevents it from being where they force your finger onto the phone or hold up the phone in front of your face. And that's probably the strongest you can do, is having it encrypted before you come to the border.
Yeah, turning off the phone is really handy. It just seems to work really well. And because it requires an additional level of security before they can force you to reveal your data.
Also, what they will do if they're taking a phone and putting it forensically is they will put it in a Faraday bag in order to stop that behavior from happening. So even if your plan was to nuke it from orbit, it may not succeed.
Right.
I think you just answered my question as to how sophisticated the CPB people are.
Okay, we're taking questions. Please have the orange cube in your hand before you ask a question.
So you were talking about going through the process and, how the border agents feel about you, probable cause and all that. If you're saying
Reasonable
no.
suspicion. I wish it'd be probable cause.
Probable cause doesn't even come into play. It's like the lower level.
I actually can drill down on that a little bit, but finish your question.
So, if you're saying no, are you better off just saying no, or if you have a good excuse as to why you're saying no?
You're better off not crossing the border.
Well, once you're in the situation, right, there you are. And this is, I have to say, it's really about your own choices. There's not a universal answer. So, maybe you feel like you would like to take some time to stand up for your rights. You have nowhere pressing to go. So if you're detained for, a couple of days, you're not too worried about it. If your devices are seized, then that will be something interesting because you can go onto the news and talk about your experience and you're excited to do it. Then that might be a time to really push on it and push the boundaries. But I'm also sympathetic that a lot of travelers, they have important things for their life, places to go, people to meet, and they don't have time to come up, deal with the consequences that might come up with saying no. But I will add one other point, which is don't consent. So, and this is a little bit of a tricky one because there's like this range of saying yes, you can do this, and they might interpret that as consent, and saying no, you may not, which could cause some of these things, some of these issues, and a sort of a better way of doing it is to say, well, I'm not going to stop you, but I don't consent to the search.
So if I'm saying no because I have encryption keys to journalists' computer infrastructure, am I better off saying that or not saying that?
So there have been examples of people who have sort of tried to talk their way through this by saying things like, they have sensitive information on the device, like information protected by the First Amendment in case of reporters' privilege sources, or perhaps they, work in a sensitive industry and they have classified information on there that it would be unlawful to give to someone who didn't have a need to know, and they, can raise some of these issues. But that will certainly bring additional scrutiny, and I don't know if you would succeed with doing that. However, you by informing them that there's First Amendment protected material on there and saying, therefore I cannot give you my consent, at least you're being polite about it, and they may seize your phone anyway. But then later, if you sue to get your phone back, and if they've done a search to have them destroy any information they've gained from that search, it may be helpful that they at least had knowledge before they began. The other thing that I wanted to say, coming off of what you mentioned, so I should clarify on the reasonable suspicion standard, at least in some circuits, have been clarified. It is about a manual search, and that a warrant is required for a forensic search. So they have to have a higher level to do a sort of a hardcore search of the device, while they can page through it in a manual search. And then if it's what they're supposed to be looking for in the manual search is digital contraband. So some of the theory why your rights are lessened at the border is that contraband can be on the phone, and as the Border Patrol, they got to look for the contraband. An example of this would be child porn, which of course could be on a phone. And what has been a lot of the range of this is that they will look at far more other things, and sometimes have found information on the phone that was not, in fact, digital contraband. That is to say, the information itself was not illegal, but it led them down other roads which led to illegal activity, and that's where they should get a warrant to go beyond what they can page through on the phone.
So if you're just a normal person passing through security and you've got nothing particular to hide, but you aren't thrilled with the idea of them going through your device, and you don't want to spend the next 8 hours in Border Patrol custody, what is it that you say to them to say, I hear you can have my phone, I know that you have the power to do that, but piss off?
I mean,
so in practice, I'm going to say that I've been in 62 countries, and I've come back many, many, many times. And in general, that question never comes up unless you look like an idiot somehow. You got to look like you're suspicious. So, no,
I'm going to push back on you a little on that because I think there is a lot of
Oh, sorry.
profiling at the. Hi.
Sorry.
There's a lot of profiling at the border, and so I think I'm going to push back on you quite
Go
a bit.
ahead, Tim, please.
Well, it's not about looking suspicious. It's about sort of.
It may also be what countries you have visited before.
True. Okay.
Like
yeah.
if you came back and you were traveling alone and you came from a country that was known for child sex tourism, they might find that was a reasonable suspicion.
Sure,
Your phone,
okay.
Even though you're not a traditionally profiled group.
Okay, well, yeah.
Well, and also, if you have been subject to a digital search previously, it makes you twice as likely for
Right.
an additional search coming through a second time. So next time you go out, expect it.
Well, maybe I'm going to be messed up now. I don't know. We'll see.
Go ahead.
Because I'm talking about this here.
I have a question, a legal question about the background, about viewing these mobile devices differently. They're commonly called the new papyrus. We read e-books. The Kindle device is called paper white. News publishers, their freedom is not dependent on publishing paper newsprint. So what's the theory behind seizing these devices with less than probable cause?
So you're referring to, of course, how the Fourth Amendment mentions your papers amongst other effects and so on. But it's not that the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to phones. In fact, the Supreme Court a couple years back had a ruling that was a very good ruling on phone searches. In that case, they were looking at searches incident to arrest. And there had been a doctrine that said, when you arrest somebody, you can look through their pockets because maybe they have a knife or something, and for officer safety, they had to look through their pockets. And then the government said, well, this is in your pocket, and so therefore we can look through it. Tried to make that sort of not a rule that was not anchored to the underlying, maybe it's a knife principle, but more that into it's in your pocket principle. And the Supreme Court said no, and they noted in that opinion that our phones are windows into our lives, that they will often have as much or more information about somebody than might be in their house, that this was absolutely something that was subject to the protections of the Fourth Amendment. So what's going on at the border is not that the Fourth Amendment is being reinterpreted, but they say that there is an exception for borders because of the need to secure the border, to look for contraband. And that was the thing that came. So this was a recent decision that came out in the Ninth Circuit, a case called U.S. v. Cano, that was dealing with this distinction I just mentioned between looking for contraband that's actually on the phone or using that to find evidence that might find other things about the person. And they were once again tying the exception into the circumstance, such that because the border has a special responsibility to stop contraband from coming into the United States, they said, okay, you can look for the contraband that might be on the phone, but you can't use that exception to then expand it to other things and go beyond what was the purpose to that exception.
I had some questions. One big question. What's the current case law? Is there any interesting case law you can discuss about the Supreme Court and on the change of justices we had recently? The outgoing justice, which side were they on?
You mean Scalia?
Well, there's been several. Yeah.
Well, one of the ones that was coming to my mind is Scalia passing on and leaving the court, and a very conservative justice. But on Fourth Amendment issues, it was an originalist and believed in the originalist interpretation of the Fourth Amendment is actually very protective of your Fourth Amendment rights. which makes sense. You go back to the origins of the Fourth Amendment. This was sort of coming after the Revolution. Some of the inspirations for the revolutions were the general warrants that the British King George would issue a warrant where they could just look wherever they liked without specifying what they were looking for, and rummage through people's stuff without having to show that there was any reason to think there was evidence of a crime. And so that's why they put the Fourth Amendment together. So it is not necessarily sort of a liberal conservative divide over the Fourth Amendment, but there still is a lot of variance, and there are several opinions out there that touch on Fourth Amendment related areas, which have given me some optimism for the future of Fourth Amendment case law in the Supreme Court, where you can count up 5 justices who at one point or another, in an opinion or in a dissent, said things that indicated that they had a view of the Fourth Amendment that was fairly protective, and understood that technology had made it so a lot of information that was in your phone, or actually especially in the cloud, should still be protected. So we're going a little bit beyond the phone here, but just bear with me a second. One of the other things that's happening in our lives is so much information about us, our personal stuff, is on someone else's computer. So, it used to be you get a letter, it would temporarily be in the postal service, and then it gets to your house, and then it was amongst your papers and protected fully in your house. You would have, your diary would be in your house. All these personal things, your records of what checks you've written, everything, you tried to keep a lot of it in your house, and then you had to work with a few third parties. And in the late 70s, they developed in the Supreme Court something called the third-party doctrine. And the notion of the third-party doctrine was that if you gave your information to a third party, that kind of meant you didn't care about it anymore, and you could avoid your Fourth Amendment rights, or you waive your Fourth Amendment rights by doing that. And the government has taken that ball and run with it, and saying things that, like, if you have stuff on the cloud, you've given it to a third party doctrine applies, and then they've tried to reverse it. So one of the arguments they made about phone search was that, people will back up their phones to the cloud, and so therefore they've waived it in the cloud, and because it's a backup, that means that they've also waived it on the phone, so ta-da, Fourth Amendment rights in your phone. And that was one of the arguments that failed in that decision. So I have some optimism that we might get there, but we have a lot of work to do, especially on border searches.
I had a question about if they do start searching your phone, is it the usual case that you can be present while they're doing it, or do you have a right to ask for that? We know that they plant digital evidence. Could they plant, physical evidence, could they plant digital evidence? We know journalists are being, treated very harshly in some cases at the border, so I'm just wondering about that aspect.
Yeah, so they may start out at least by saying, hey, could you unlock this phone and page through it? But if they decide to do a more intensive search, they will take it into the back room, and you do not have a right to be there. In fact, they could take it to an off-site facility that has a lot of forensic tools. And, you can, I think, if you were criminally charged over this, then you would be entitled to get evidence about what they had done, whether they had planted something on your phone. You could question the veracity of the forensic software, whether it was actually showing it was untampered with, and do that through the litigation process and defending the case. If they didn't bring charges and just handed your phone back, then you wouldn't be entitled to that discovery. You might be wondering if there is something on your phone. I have not seen any evidence of that happening at the U.S. border, but I have seen evidence of that happening on certain foreign borders, where people will have their phones taken away and malware placed upon the phones and then handed back. But probably, you should have lots of backups, and a good practice would be, if your phone is out of your hands and out of your sight, when you get it back, wipe it and replace it from backup.
So I think my question relates to the last one. But if you're in that awful situation, you're at the border and you've got someplace to be, and they say, we want to take a look at your photos for contraband, and you provide consent for that portion of the search because you want to move on. You unlock your phone, they start looking at the photos, but then they start taking a look at other stuff. Can you remove consent? Can you...
So you can... Well, let's distinguish between what you can consent to and what you can stop them from doing. And so I would actually suggest you say, like, I don't consent to this, but if I'm required to do it, if you order me to do it, I will obey your order. And but it's not, you're just clarifying that it's not consent. Or maybe you want to play it differently and say, look, I will consent to you looking at my photos, but to nothing else. If they start looking at something else, you can say, hey, I didn't consent to that, and they can be like, yep.
But they already got your phone.
They got your phone, it's unlocked, and,
That's nice, they say.
Yeah. And look, if this ever happens to you, also try to make notes. I mean, ideally, you would, from our point of view, right, we want to see impact litigation on this and, try and fight these things. Take notes of what happened. Get the name of the agent. Say, write down immediately as soon as you're out of that situation how it happened, what you consented to, what you didn't consent to, when they took the phone, what did they order you, what did they say, all the details that you can remember, and do it as quickly as possible so you don't forget, so that if you are going to be suing over this later, you have those details.
Right. So you mentioned that on the foreign side, one of the aspects of this is a lot of our foreign travel is going to be round trip. So the U.S. customs side of this is complicated enough that we have a whole session on it. So I'm not going to ask you to explain all of different foreign ports, but are there any resources that you're aware of that kind of enumerate what to expect at customs agencies in other countries? They might not be,
I did a presentation at the Chaos Communications Congress on going through a bunch of different countries outside of the U.S., and it's available online, so you can search for CCC Kurt Opsahl border search, and you can watch the presentation. I don't hit all of the countries. There's far too many countries to go over, but hit the European Union. Talk about Canada. Turns out Canada thinks that you have to turn over your password. UK as well. Actually, that you can be criminally charged with not turning over your password. And they're and different strategies for those countries. And if you're going to a country where you have reason to believe that you're at extra risk of getting searched, and you have some things that shouldn't be searched, for example, if you're going to meet with opposition figures or activists that are, in an authoritarian regime, and the authoritarian regime might be looking for that, that is a perfectly good time to not bring that information with you, because you might have a much better time and security downloading it once you get to the far destination over a VPN with security, encrypted file, and all those things, than trying to sort of handle that over the phone. So, go over the border. If they take your phone, you get it back, you reset it to factory defaults, and then revive it from backup with the data that you need, and then only bring the data that you need, even those circumstances. Keep it very lightweight. If you have a laptop, think of something like a Chromebook, where a Chromebook, by its nature, everything is sort of particular, is of the cloud. You can have that go through factory defaults, and it just runs an operating system. So these are some of the ways you can sort of not take it with you if you're going to a country that you're worried about.
So what I'm finding right now is that the only thing that's protected is attorney-client privilege material, attorney work product, and that there's a filter team within the CBP that will segregate this protected material. Otherwise, There's no special protections provided for journalists, sensitive political material, trade secrets, medical information, or materials that would otherwise be privileged by law. So everything else is fair game.
Very scary.
Yeah, and note with that the filter team, they're still looking at it.
I pulled up on the screen.
They're not going to try and
refuses to
remember
reveal his
Sorry,
password.
I was just going to finish up on that.
Sorry, we'll just let Kurt finish up and then.
That the filter team is still a government agent looking at your material, and you're trusting them to be able to identify what is privileged material, which if they don't know, like, the name of your attorney, and the attorney doesn't write this is privileged on every document, right, they'll have a tough time figuring that out. So it is a very imperfect protection.
Go ahead, Randal. Good.
Yeah, this is scary here.
Was there something you wanted to say about it?
I'm just saying that I just pulled up. The guy refused to give his password, and they were challenging him with laws. $1,000, 20 to 5,000 Canadian. Yeah.
Right.
So
They really
scary.
sort of take advantage of the situation of, you want to get somewhere, you're stressed out.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. Next question, please.
So I'm kind of encouraged. I'm looking around the room, people of all different ages. That's good. The reason I mention that is that I've heard of people under 40, certainly under 30, referred to as the post-privacy generation. So much of their lives is public. So much of our lives are out there, public, and so I'm just concerned that maybe some people aren't as concerned about privacy. And this is a little bit meta for what we're talking about, I guess.
So,
but I'm wondering if the struggle is becoming more difficult as we go along, and more information is just out there, and we just accept it, or people pushing back more.
So I'm actually going to challenge your premise. That I think I've heard this around, like a lot of places. A lot of from people who are not of the younger generation will say the younger generation doesn't care about privacy because they share a lot of information online. But actually, if you talk to people, they do care about privacy, and they are putting things out there that they want to put out there, or if it is going broader than they wanted it, is because they misunderstood the settings, not because they wanted it to be as public as it eventually got. And there's people who are growing up in an age where they actually are much more sophisticated about how to share things, how to curate what public persona. Many of them, there's a trend where they'll have multiple Instagrams, and there'll be one which is for sharing very privately with their friends, and another one which they have to face the possibility that their parents will see it, and it is curated appropriately. And also on what things are you doing. So Facebook is for communicating with older generation people, and then they have Snapchat, or nowadays TikTok, to communicate with people of their own generation using techniques like disappearing messages. So I don't think that it's actually that they don't care as much about privacy, even though you can choose, while caring about privacy, what to put forward. In fact, that is sort of the one way of looking at the right of privacy is the right to be let alone, to make your own choices. But it's not only for people who want to go off the grid and live in the woods, and they're living in a modern life with having those choices.
You mentioned earlier that
A little bit louder, sir. Sorry.
You mentioned earlier they have the right to sort of thumb through what's openly available, but if you're logged off, they can't force you to divulge those passwords. Would that also apply to things that are like separately encrypted on the device?
So, I think just to hit on some of the themes. What you're asking about is when they're doing sort of that next level of search, where they are not just looking at what's on the device, but using the passwords that are stored or in apps while you're logged in order to get onto your cloud services, or potentially if there's something which is an encrypted blob that they found on the device, and they ask you to do that. Those are two slightly different scenarios. So under this notion of looking for digital contraband, that gives them no good basis to do a warrantless search of your cloud computing. So they can ask you for the password to your Facebook. But if they do so, and then you're faced with these terrible no-win situations about if you refuse, this escalates the matter, and you may lose your device. If you comply, they get to look at it. But at least you know that they were going to look at your cloud devices, and so if you're going to try and bring a challenge to it later, you can say they exceeded the scope of the manual search, exceeded the scope of the looking for digital contrabands. That's advantageous to a later challenge. If it is an encrypted blob that is on the device, well, then they can say this fits within the digital contraband. And just to bring another amendment into play, then you have the Fifth Amendment coming into play. Your right not to self-incriminate. So you could, for example, refuse to answer that question on Fifth Amendment grounds. This is something which has been disputed in the courts. The general notion is that the Fifth Amendment protects information that is sort of testimonial in nature. So the thing that giving the password shows is that it's your information, that you have control over it. If they don't know that otherwise, then it's testimonial, and people have successfully pushed back on being forced to divulge their password when giving it would reveal that additional piece of information. But if they already know that you control this information, for example, there was one case in which somebody did give a password to something, and then the machine locked, and they refused to give it again, and the court ordered them to give it again because they had already given it and done that testimonial aspect. So, again, these are the tough choices. Do you want to potentially lose your device while they try and crack the encryption on your phone? Have it, months, 10 months up to before you get your device back, but maximize your rights. And if you're in a position to do that, well, then you can refuse. But also, I just understand that many people just are not in a practical circumstance where they can exercise that right and still be able to make it to their job and live their lives.
It appears, though, there's also a major difference between CBP and ICE's abilities from what I'm seeing here. What I'm seeing is, and I'll just read it to you, the disjunction between CBP and ICE to some extent reflects their respective streams of authority, customs, and immigration. The former emphasizes finding contraband, while the latter focuses on the character of individuals entering the country, partially explaining ICE's broader search powers in regard to online information and data stored on the cloud. So it appears ICE actually can go in and access the information held on the cloud, while CBP is somewhat more restricted in what they're allowed to access, when, and how.
I think that's an important thing. If you are not a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, you're coming in on a visa, then they are entitled to look at things. In fact, now it's required for your visa application that you give your online handles at every social media that you have, and they have a long list of social media. And they can look at that thing. And this happened recently. There was a student who had a student visa to go study at Harvard, and came in at the border, and they looked at the kid's Facebook and decided to exclude the kid, not for anything the kid said, but because people he knew who were his Facebook friends made comments on his feed that they interpreted as anti-American. The kid was from Palestine, and on the basis of sort of association with the other folks, denied entry. which is pretty tough, especially since for a lot of people their standard for a Facebook friend is much lower than the standard for a friend. It might be someone who you've met once in your life, or maybe never even in person, and you're just like, yeah, sure, we'll be Facebook friends, and then you're sort of charged with knowing them and charged with what opinions they might have.
I had a question about disappearing emails and texts, and on that note, about once you send it to somebody else and they're carrying around your information on their devices and you don't know what they're doing with it. I've heard of emails being disappeared at various places like Facebook or wherever. They send some email and then it disappears out of people's inboxes, so they can never have proof that something was sent to them, for example. So is there like a way to recall like old emails where you might have sent people sensitive information so that it's now also out of their emails?
No. So if you send an email, then the other person has a copy, and they can do with that copy kind of as they will, including they may back it up. There are like some features of email programs which have sort of like a recall button, designed for like when you accidentally hit reply all instead of reply, and you're like, oh no, and then you like recall. But it doesn't, like, it can kind of work if you catch it on the server, but for most of those things, it is just hiding the fact that you had sent that. It is not actually sort of destroying the copy. So if you send an email, there'll be a copy on your machine that sent it from, or in your sent folder. And then whoever has it, they can do it as they will.
I think that's worked for me maybe 20% of the time when I go, darn! Yeah, and just 20% of the time.
So I'm a big fan of two-factor authentication, and I was actually wondering, because I was thinking of a scenario where if the device that is my second factor is not the phone in question, and let's say I do decide to hand over my device, and then they request a Facebook password and so on and so forth, but my two-factor is such that I actually need access to equipment I don't have on site. Mm-hmm. Would that become a problem for me, even if I was trying to comply? Literally, I'm not hiding anything up my sleeve. I just don't have the access to the equipment in question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it'd be a nice thing to add to like why you can't do this. That it's literally impossible. And not having a second factor is at least a little bit more plausible than I forgot my password, because that may look kind of suspicious. But like at the end of the day, it's weird because now they can't get on your phone, and looks like you're hiding something. And customs agents are very highly suspicious of those kinds of activities. So again, it sort of comes down to like, what is your tolerance for hassle? They may say, okay, that's fine, but we're taking your phone.
I'll just tell them, keep hitting that button, buddy, 10 times.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I could go through different hypotheticals around encryption and moving data and blah, blah, blah. But let's just be realistic and assume at one point I'm going to be belligerent and say no, and, the do not consent signs and stickers I have on everything are going to be a giveaway. What do I do after the initial detainment, right? They hold me however many hours they're legally allowed to keep me locked in a room while they ask for passwords and stuff. Do I call you when I get out? What's the process?
No, you call your attorney.
Well, and that's, what it's like.
You can reach out to EFF, absolutely. If you have had your devices seized at the border where it was an attempt at a digital search, you refused the password, you can reach out to EFF, and if we can't represent you directly, we'll try and hook you up with an attorney who can.
And you keep thinking there's a number of hours, but there's no number of hours.
And I think also very important thing is for whether you end up being represented by EFF, by ACLU, by other attorneys who are interested in this subject area. Make notes about everything that happened.
Yes.
Suppose you're carrying a phone that belongs to your employer and is not your personal phone, and you have it as part of your job. Can I say I don't have the authority to give you to consent for this phone because it belongs to my employer? You'll have to ask them.
I mean,
interesting question.
Sure, and you can say that, and this it is probably unlikely that that's going to be very impressive to them if they feel that there's a reason they really need to look at your phone. But you could say, yeah, this is a work phone, and then they may ask, okay, can I speak to your supervisor about the matter, and how do I get in touch with someone who has that authority? Or they might just say, okay, great, I'm taking your phone. Like I said, like on some circumstances, yeah, and then some companies would have different reactions to this. I think for a number of companies, the policy is don't stop them from taking the phone, and we will just issue you a new phone that's from backup, and whenever we get that one back, we will wipe it. See where it goes from there. And you have the phone, if your employer is caring about these sort of things, hopefully it will be encrypted.
This is just a follow-up to the question about getting the email back after you've sent it, and you guys addressed that it would be in their sent folder and the recipient has it, but there's also the servers that these reside on. I'm an Exchange administrator, so if this was your work email account, then I would be able to use the e-discovery features to pull your deleted email up for 30 days. And even if it was more than 30 days ago, I can go dig it off of a backup disk. I have no idea what Gmail's retention policies are. It all depends entirely. I mean, probably forever, I don't know. But it all depends on, the servers, the individual servers have their data retention policies. So, there's that as well.
And if you really want to have that's all correct, and there's many forensic ways of getting this. If you really want to have a communication that goes to somebody that is use an encrypted communication, so that yes, it'll also be copied in all these places, but they will just get the encrypted text, and only the recipient should be able to unlock it. So you can do this through messaging, through apps like the Signal app, or WhatsApp, or iMessage, so long as you're going to another iMessage, but not if you're not. Or if you're relatively sophisticated, PGP for email. I think PGP is a very strong in terms of the encryption of it, but its user interface is sometimes challenging, but it's another method.
I'm just thinking about trying to get a connecting flight. Is there an average time that these phone searches take?
So if you are brought into additional scrutiny, they really care about you, you're probably not going to make your connecting flight. The thing is, it is variable. It is entirely possible for a situation to be that, they're kind of wondering about you, and they say, hey, do you mind if I look at the phone? And you're like, sure, here you go. And they sort of flip through your vacation photos for a sec and say, oh, this looks like, nothing suspicious here. And then you're done, right? That can happen.
Connecting flights are often very tight anyway, so
you don't know that it's happening. I'm just going to finish up, and then you can go on. So you don't know that it's happening, right? Whether it's going to be an extensive search or a short search, and this is a little bit of the bet that you're making. But if you're making sort of the choice to not turn over the information, expect that they will want to talk to you for a while longer.
Yeah. Connecting flights are often very tight, so if you're already pulled aside, you're pretty much screwed.
So I was thinking
hold
about.
On. So did you want to say something?
I wanted to ask, Kurt, what do you know about the bright line policy. Are you familiar?
The bright line policy, I'm sorry, is it a bright line rule?
Bright line rule, yes.
Right, a bright line rule is a kind of rule where there's a distinction between one end and the other. There's a very clear line between those distinctions.
Mhm.
So many things have bright line rules. I'm sorry, we'll get something in particular. Actually. Which bright
maybe.
line rule
All right, while they confer, go ahead and ask your question.
bright line is a type of rule?
It was
for
probably
Kurt.
for Kurt.
Okay. We'll just take a second.
Sorry, we're reading up here. I have no idea what that's about.
You know you're getting really up-to-the-minute information because we are
Up to the
researching in
minute,
front of
up
you.
to the minute. Information right here. We're reading. And sorry for my throat again.
Is there a...
Yes. Well, so just to say, like, bright line rules are a type of rule where it's very clear. The bright line rule that Kara was mentioning is that for an immigration search, once it is established that you are indeed a citizen or a permanent resident, then they have no reason to do further searches because there's no additional information that they need to have. And so they should stop investigating once they've established that you are a citizen or a permanent resident.
Go ahead, sir. Thanks for your patience.
So I was, I can't remember the full details, but there was something, I think it was on the register, about PGP key server being compromised and malicious keys being inserted. And I was...
Remember that.
Oh, no,
It wasn't any malicious.
Okay.
So this is the public key server?
Yeah.
So it was compromised in the sense that people put in public keys for other people?
Actually, he said it was a DDoS.
They overloaded the connection, so they dumped like 250,000 validations in the web of trust and they're crashing different PGP.
Okay, so it was it's hard for me to hear you, but a DDoS attack?
Yeah. So they DDoS, but it got me thinking about other methods of public key exchanging, and QR codes are a nightmare. You can't get anyone security conscious to use them because obvious reasons. Does anyone have any ideas on like how to put public key on a business card?
Well, a lot of people, if they want to do this, will put in a key fingerprint on their business card, which is going to be shorter than the key, but a long series of hexadecimal numbers that you can use for key verification, and then just handing you the physical card. But this is one of the issues with PGP, is that authentication is hard. Not a lot of people will sign each other's keys. Occasionally you'll have like a key signing party, but that is generally most popular amongst people who already know how to use PGP and are using it frequently. So that has been like one of the challenges of PGP is doing key management. Another issue that is just sort of coming up because you were mentioning the key server is that somebody else can put up a key to your email address and say that that's your key, and if that person gets a message that is encrypted to their fake key, then they can decrypt it. And occasionally you will find it where usually like famous people or such will have multiple keys on the key server and only one of them is actually their key.
One of the solutions that you mentioned for this problem is to just leave your devices at home. Is that suspicious on its own if they ask me for my device and I say I don't have it, and they say, well, do you have one at all? And I say, well, I didn't take it with me. Is that a problem, and is that going to be a different answer for citizens and non-citizens?
Well, to hit the citizens versus non-citizens, if you don't have a right to enter, then they can turn you away for whatever they want. And if the way that comes across to them is that, like, this is something shady going on here, why doesn't he have a phone? Then that might be, suspicious enough that they want to either do further investigations or maybe deny entry. if you do have a right of entry, then they can be really suspicious about it, but you still get to enter the country. They may decide to look through your luggage and ask you a few more questions and such, but you still don't have a phone. It also probably depends a lot on how plausible it is that you don't have a phone. This might be making some judgments about, how old you are, what you look like, and whether you might be someone who isn't part of the mobile phone revolution. But it probably, if you're worried about that, have a cheap phone that is just a simple phone with none of your data on it, and just carry that across and that's my phone.
All right, I'm going to exercise my moderator's privilege. I think we talk about a lot of heavy issues on this track, and sometimes it can be a little depressing. So I want to end by asking, Kurt, you've mentioned a couple things that give you hope. Is there legislation we can support? Are there FOIA requests we can file? Are there groups that that we can reach out to, so we can move maybe not forward with hope, but at least with grim determination?
There is some legislation that Senator Wyden put forward about border searches.
Oregon! Senator Wyden.
Senator Wyden of Oregon. It hasn't really moved very strongly right now, so we'll see how that goes, but it's something that if you're a citizen of Oregon, you can call up Wyden, or actually and thank him for that, or support the bill with if you're citizens elsewhere. Talk to your senators and say that you care about this issue and you want to have our Fourth Amendment rights at the border. For FOIA, we've done a number of Freedom of Information Act requests, trying to get hold of information about how the policies are working, and with some success. But FOIA's a tough one. And then I want to also say another very important thing that you all can do is rate this program on the DragonCon app.
Kurt's doing my job for me.
Please do.
Did you have anything?
So yeah, FOIA is definitely a tool that everybody can use, but when you go to make your FOIA request, always remember that you need to be very specific in what you're asking for. Otherwise, you're going to get a bill from the government that is going to be outrageous. So do your research first before you send in your requests, and keep your requests specific and narrow. But definitely go get your information so that you can, become more educated, take it to your legislators, and, fight for your rights.
All right. Thank you all very much for your time, and please do remember to rate us in the app.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Oh, hold on.
Apparently there's one more question.
See some of you at Hacker 201.
Hang on just a second. One more question. I had heard, I've been hearing more increasingly that we have more searches occurring that are completely domestic flights that are not border related. That would mean TSA. Have you heard anything about this?
So I have not heard of TSA doing a border-like search where they're looking inside your phone. I mean, TSA certainly searches you as you go on the plane, but the most I've ever seen and heard of them doing to a phone is swabbing it for explosive residue or whatever they're looking for as part of their security theater.